on today's Story Beat.
And when you were talking about doing a single panel gag, in some ways it's easier than doing a strip, and in some ways it's harder.
I would imagine that in some ways it probably is easier because you just have the one concept.
With a strip, you always have to have, them saying something here and saying something, and then a final panel. I can do just the final panel, and the key is to have the gag or what they're saying clearly be what, mommy asked this question, this is the kid's answer, and I'm just showing the kid's answer. And so everybody who's reading it is actually doing the previous line without it ever being said.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today is the renowned cartoonist Jeff Keane. 2 years after Jeff was born, his father, the legendary Bill Keane, started chasing him around, begging him to do something funny. So began Jeff's career as a cartoon model for the family Circus. Raised in Arizona, Jeff moved to California to attend the University of Southern California, where he received his BFA in drama. After graduation, in an attempt to have a freer schedule for auditioning, he returned to his cartoon roots and began to assist his father. He started out answering mail and compiling books, but now after many years and with his father's advice and guidance, he now writes, inks, and colors the family Circus, which appears daily in more than 1,300 newspapers worldwide. It's also the most widely syndicated panel in America today. In 2007 and again in 2009, Jeff was elected the president of the National Cartoonist Society, the world's premier organization of professional cartoonists. Along with other members of the NCS and with the helping hand of the USO, Jeff has made numerous visits to military bases and hospitals around the world, including to both Iraq and Afghanistan. On a separate note, Jeff and I have known one another since our days together as students at USC. So it is with considerable happiness that I welcome my longtime friend, Jeff Keane, to StoryBeat today. Jeff, it's a great joy to have you join me today.
Great to talk to you again, Steve.
So when we met back at USC, you were into theater and performance. That's what you were doing. You were a drama major. At what age did you get an interest in the theater in the first place? How old were you?
Boy, well, I've been basically performing since I was 2 years old for my dad.
Right.
In some ways, I can remember him telling when he first started the Family Circus in 1960, and I was 2. And then he would do a lot of presentations. And I remember there was one presentation that he was doing, I think it was Grady Gamage Auditorium or someplace like that in Phoenix. And at the end, he did a drawing of me, and he had me run out on stage as, oh, and here's Jeffy, or whatever. Now I don't really remember that, but I remember my mom and dad telling me about it. And then from growing up, there was 5 kids, and my sister was the oldest, and then there was 4 boys, and I was the youngest. And so in some ways, I was performing then too. And then as I went to grade school, I can remember doing little sketches, redoing the Carol Burnett show sketches with as Tim Conway, the old man. I would play the little old man in the front of the room, and my friend at that time was Steve O'Connor, and Steve O'Connor would play the other part, and we'd get a lot less laughs than Carol Burnett did. But and then when I went to then I remember getting a video camera. I think probably in 8th grade, maybe. Mom bought me well, it wasn't video camera then. It was actually a Super 8 camera. And then I had a friend who wasn't in my high school, but I belonged to a tennis club and his name was Bill Rickert. And Bill and I just became the best of friends, and we started to make movies, and we would go to movies, and it just became a thing. And finally, in I think my junior year of high school, I finally auditioned for a show. I went to Brophy College Preparatory in Phoenix, and it was an all-boys school. And so, but it was next door to an all-girls school, so at least you could see what the opposite sex looked like. And then we went, and then they did Arsenic and Old Lace was the show, and so I auditioned for Arsenic and Old Lace, and I got the part as eventually as Jonathan, who's the brother who looks like Boris Karloff, and then from then on. When I finally graduated from high school, back then, pursuit of college and things was such a sort of simple thing. I would either go to ASU or I'd go to USC. And at the last minute, USC accepted me, but as undeclared. I was trying to get into the cinema school.
Right.
And so I went to USC that freshman year in 1976. As undeclared, and I just took basic classes, an English class and a whatever class and a foreign language class, French, which I had to drop out of because I couldn't understand what they were saying. I didn't realize there's a whole nother language. And
it was in French. That's why.
Oh, that was the key, I guess. That's what it was. And so, but then. I was able to, between the semester, after the first semester, declare and get into the theater program. And then from then on, that really put me on the trajectory that I was. Because once I met those people who were the Bachelor of Fine Arts students at the time, we did everything together, and it became much more of a, I don't know, it was just friendships. That was what was really important to me at the time. And progressively more and more, I would do more acting and even doing, stagecraft or doing the, backstage, or I was a stage manager for Music Man. I think the first second semester of 77 or whatever, and all that. I was the Wells Fargo man. I had, but in that sense, it was only all I had to do was I pulled the stagecoach on stage. There wasn't really a part, but in those days, they weren't going to have horses, so I just pulled it on and left it there.
One of your buddies is a recent guest on the show. That's Debbie Dashinger.
Oh yes,
and Debbie has her own show, Dare to Dream, and I've been on it. Have you been on her show?
No, I haven't. Debbie and I, we've done so many things together. I'm not sure I could just have a simple conversation with Debbie, because Debbie was one of the people who, in those first years, and then through all of them, we ended up in a theater group together and all those things. So I think that maybe. I even dated Debbie for a little while, so I think maybe
too complicated.
We know too much about each other.
Too complicated. Too complicated.
Yeah, no, because she did ask me one time. I just thought, I'm not sure I could answer seriously. If you're asking me questions seriously, whether I could answer them as easily with her. I might spend all my time just laughing, going, "You got to be kidding me."
So I'm assuming, and we'll get into what you do now, which is really remarkable, but I'm assuming that at some point you really sort of stopped doing theater. About how long ago was that?
Well, it was, I really stopped doing theater in about 1988 when I got married. But I started right out of college. Like I said, we did a theater group together. For about 2 years. It was called Act 4, and there was 8 or 10 of us from that BFA class, and we did, I think, 4 or 5 shows in total. And then everybody sort of drifted apart, And I got a job working at a clothing sportswear store, and I couldn't really audition that much because of the schedule and also just laziness. And then my dad said, "Hey, well, if you want to try and help me do some stuff, you could work as, in those days I'd put together books or maybe do some coloring of something or put together calendars or whatever." And that was in about 81 or 82. And so I started doing that, and I did do shows during that period. I did several, but mostly community theater type shows. I did a couple commercials, and that was it. But then gradually I did more and more with my dad, where eventually I was doing penciling, and I drifted away from theater more. And I eventually got married in 1988, and I moved south of LA, actually down to in Laguna Niguel, which is next to where I live now in Laguna Hills.
Right.
And it was partly because at that time I could live anywhere. When I was working with my dad, I looked at houses in Arizona, I looked at Southern California, and the value was so broad. I could buy a huge place in Arizona compared to California.
Sure, of course.
But all my friends were here, and actually one of my best friends, Darcy Rice, lived in San Clemente, and so we moved down to Laguna Niguel, just sort of to. We used to vacation in Laguna Beach every year from Arizona. We'd drive and spend a couple of weeks, 3 weeks in.
So you knew your way around already.
Yeah, and it was just very comfortable, and so that's really what. And then theater went away as far as auditioning and performing.
Sure.
And
so all right. So did you learn how to draw from your father, or?
Yeah. Yes. Pretty much. No, I couldn't. I was not as good a drawer as he was, or as skilled, but I was pretty good at, if I saw something of, making it look like that. And in some ways I appreciated the challenge of it. It was a beyond my skill, so to speak, of being able to do it. There was a point where I was doing penciling, and he would pencil a cartoon. I'd send it to my dad, and he would correct them, and then he had a guy who inked the cartoons. So
let's just stop right there for a second. For the listeners who don't know, what does inking mean?
Nowadays, a lot of this stuff is done in the computer.
Sure.
But I've always done it where it was it's on a piece of paper, and you pencil it, and then the inking is taking it. A lot of people take a pen, and they'll makes it black basically.
So,
and then
so you're taking the pencil sketch and actually making it solid with a black pen of some kind.
Right, and it's what you would see if you looked in the newspaper. That's what the original looked like. Black, white. That was it. It just turned into a black and white drawing.
Right.
And,
but you needed the pencil to sketch things out to know what you were doing in the first place, right?
Right. Yeah, especially me. So I was trying to imitate my dad's style. Basically, I had no style, so it was basically I was making it look like what he had done.
So you didn't go to school to be an artist. You schooled yourself through your father.
No, yes, although I remember in I think second grade, the class did some sort of thing where we were all doing drawings, and I drew a drawing of the teacher, and everybody was like, "Oh," and I can remember it. I think it was Mrs. Feeney who was the teacher, and I remember that day, and it was always. And then through grade school too, we would do projects, with art and things, do posters and those type of things. And I would do them, and usually they were well received. And even when we were doing Act 4, I did the poster for the various shows. So I was always doing it, but I was not a skilled artist at all.
But you enjoyed doing it.
Yes, yeah, I enjoyed the final product, probably more than necessarily getting there, because it was difficult for me to necessarily figure out, okay, how do I get there and how do I do this exactly, because I wasn't doing it all the time, as opposed to like my dad, who from a young age he was constantly drawing, or my brother Glenn. That's all he would do. They just loved to draw all the time, and their skills are so superior to what my skills were at the time.
We should let the listeners also know that when you say your brother Glenn, that's Glenn Keane, who's a major animation director. Where's he now? Is he still at Disney, or?
No, he left Disney about 6, 7 years ago.
And where's he working now?
He has his own production company, and they just did the movie Over the Moon. Glenn directed Over the Moon. He won the Academy Award 2 years ago for Dear Basketball with Kobe Bryant.
Right.
And Glenn drew that.
So art is in the family. It's clearly in the blood. And
yeah,
when you started to draw, it wasn't like a burden to you. You enjoyed it.
No. Yeah, no, it's not a burden. And the thing is that art, in the sense, people go, oh, all you guys can really draw. And to me, art is not necessarily drawing, so to speak. It's more of it's all the categories. Like I have my sister at one time was doing photography, and then she was doing she was a florist for years, and she still and she can still do this. And to me, that's an artistic skill.
Sure,
my oldest brother was a musician for years, and he still does music. He's an engineer now, and actually worked on the Mars landing craft, and did a chip that was for the location and stuff. But he always had that artistic background too. He had bands, and that's what he was doing for years. And then in order to make real money, I guess he went into engineering. Then then there's Glenn, and then there's my brother Chris, who for years was a writer, and he was writing things. And see, to me, all of those are the same. They're just different branches of artistic skills. And part of that has to do with, I think, in growing up, my mom and dad just let us do those artistic things. I think in those days there was a lot of parents who might have looked down on kids who wanted to draw or perform or do those things. Well, those aren't going to make you any money, or those things. And so they kind of lose that skill, when those are really vital learning skills for kids to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no question, most people, I think, that go into theater in particular, or dance or something like that, there are lots of parents that say, this is lovely, have a good time, but don't think this is going to be your life, because there's no way for you to make a living at it. And yet, if it gets into your bloodstream, that's it. You're hooked, and you just keep going at it. And what you're talking about, obviously art was, in your family, and not only, it sounds like it was not only encouraged, but welcomed, and go do it.
Yeah. Yes. I think, it was more of, if you really enjoyed this, then you should do that.
That's rare. That's not all that common. A lot of parents fear that their children will wind up, not able to support themselves. So.
Right. I can remember my mom saying to me, so are you happy? And her thing was always, she wanted to make sure that you were happy in what you were doing.
Mm-hmm.
We get so absorbed into, well, I got to do this, but it doesn't really bring any happiness to me or whatever it is. And I found that actually doing the cartoon is in some ways is similar to me performing on stage.
How so?
Well, because I would, you're setting a scene, and then you're delivering the dialogue by what the gag is or how the kid would say it, and so I'm putting myself in the position of trying to figure out what would be the right way to say this or what would be the wrong way to say that. So in some ways it's just like on stage, there's my little stage and I make my little presentation. Then when I'm trying to come up with those things, and also the other thing that was similar for me was in some ways theater I enjoyed after the show was done. And you kind of go and you can see people and it's a bit of an ego thing in some ways that you've got, it makes you feel really good. And the Family Circus has done that for me also, where people who when I say, I'm doing the Family Circus, where there's a look in their eyes that's sort of very nice. And it sure is great to be able to know that, you do the Family Circus, that's I really like that, as opposed to who knows whatever it would be. They tend to have a really joy about in their mind. You can read it in their minds about they're thinking of, and that's was my dad's genius, was he created something that was really unique. I mean, it's not so unique, but it was unique in reaching people on a different level than what most cartoons, so to speak, at that time.
Well, he clearly he created something that has a very durable legacy. It's gone on for what, 60 plus years at this point.
Plus, yeah, 60.
So that for you to carry that off for 60 plus years, that means there was something in the initial concept of it and the creation of it. And part of it, I think, is that everybody can recognize their own family, and it doesn't matter what culture you're in or your race, creed, color, religion. It doesn't matter. You can recognize family in it. What were the mantras that he gave to you that you still abide by? What did he teach you about the storytelling and so on? And I do want to say that it's similar what you're talking about. You are the director, you're the writer, you're the actor because you're acting it out, you're the scenic designer, you're all those things. But right. What were his mantras to you about, here's the way you need to think about doing this single panel cartoon?
Well, in some ways, doing the single panel cartoon, he would maintain it needed to be true. I mean, you certainly go off slightly from what might be true, but when he first started the Family Circus in 1960, the cartoon was much more gag driven and silly little things going on in the family, and more funny, so to speak. And then once it got into the mid 60s, he was doing cartoons, and he did a particular cartoon, which was Jeffy coming in, and mommy and daddy were watching TV, and the light of the TV, and Jeffy's there clear in his pajamas with his blanket and saying, "I don't think I feel so good. I think I need a hug." And the response to that particular cartoon was such that he realized, he's touching a chord. Or, it wasn't about being funny all the time. There was lots of cartoons in the newspaper that are funny all the time.
Of course.
And so that became unique. And part of it was my mom's brilliance and ability to make it okay. My dad she was his editor all the time. And his joke was always, she's the most kissable editor I ever knew. But, and she would see every cartoon that he would do before he sent it, and she would look at it and go, this is good, these are good. And that if you're showing the family that loves each other, that's true. This is the way we were. These are all real life situations, just skewered a little bit. And it's okay to have a tug at the heart or a lump in the throat. It's all right to do that.
Well, I think that's the hallmark of your cartoon. I think that
it was, but but he realized that you didn't have to have the kid slip and fall or do all this stuff. It was more about the family situation and to maintain it in that whole situation. And I think it partly had to do with my dad was always drawing what was around him. We all grew up. We were all born in Philadelphia. He lived in Philadelphia, my mom and dad, and then the 5 kids. But when I was 9 months old, he was doing magazine gags and newspaper. And he was working Philadelphia Bolton, and he realized he could live anywhere, so to speak. He went to the doctor office, and the doctor said, "Hey, Bill, you've got these allergies. You could, maybe Pennsylvania is not the best place for all this." And so in the doctor's office was an Arizona Highways magazine. And so he saw it and said, "Oh, maybe Arizona, that's where he could go." And so went and talked to my mom, and my mom, who was Australian, all that, she had moved from her family. So she had no family around. So we were the center for her, we were the family. And so basically she was willing to move wherever, as long as we were all together. And so then they moved to Arizona in 1959. And then he was selling magazine cartoons or whatever. And he found that most of the magazine cartoons he's selling or were doing with family. And then he said, "Oh, I'll do a cartoon about family." And so that's when he started in 1960.
Was his 100% inspiration your family, or did he look elsewhere for inspiration?
Well, 100% is kind of hard to say. I mean, I would say 90% of it was coming from us, because that's what, he would stand. I remember him standing at the window and looking. We always thought, well, Dad really likes us, but really he was just looking for ideas. Sometimes he would buy, they would buy some toy or whatever, and he'd give it to us and see what came about. Now, later on, after he passed away, then I was looking through his proofs, and on certain cartoons, he would write, this boat was bought as to see what it was given to the kids to see what ideas, and then it was donated, so he got sort of a tax write-off for our toys.
Well, your toys were research.
That's right. Luckily, he's no longer living, so I don't think the IRS can come after him.
No, I think that time has probably moved along.
Yeah.
So when did you take over? When did you start? When were you good enough? When did you know you were good enough to start doing that?
Well, in the 1990s, by then I was doing a lot of the penciling and a lot of finished stuff. And then in the early 90s, Dad said, "Hey, Jeff, did you ever think about trying to ink the cartoon?" And I was like, "Oh, I can't ink, Dad. I don't know how to do that." And Dad's inker at the time was Bud Warner, who had been inking the cartoon for, I don't know, since the late 60s or so. And this guy, and his ink work was phenomenal. And he would use a brush as opposed to like a pen.
Right.
When my dad would originally ink the cartoon, it was done with a pen, but so Bud was doing a brush. And I said, "Dad, I don't think I can do that. Bud does such work. So why don't you give it a try? Give it a try." And since I didn't really know how to ink anyway, I said, "Okay, well, I'll try it with a brush." And over, I don't know, a year or so, I got to where it looked pretty good. And, Dad was happy. And and then I sort of felt like, oh my God, now I'm kicking Bud out of a job.
Oh.
But in the end, luckily, my dad and Bud were basically the same age. And as I found out later from my dad, he said, well, Bud was kind of happy that you started to do it because he felt like he was getting up there in age, and he really felt like he was starting to let my dad down because his skill level had slightly it wasn't quite as good as he was or whatever, which I certainly never noticed, but it made me feel a little better. I mean, maybe my dad made the story up, but I believed it. And so and then maybe 98, 99 is when I was really doing all the inking of the cartoon. And then
So were you also doing the pencil sketches as well?
Yeah. My dad would send a rough, just a sketch of the cartoon, and eventually it became like a little 3x5 piece of paper, and he would do it, and I would put it on a Xerox machine and blow it up, and then put it to the size of a circle, which was about 8 inches round, and draw it in, and then ink it and send it back to him. In those days, there was no fax machine. I mean, there was no way of getting stuff back and forth.
So you actually need to blow it up to size to make your life a little easier. You don't do it in the small size.
I can't. Yes, it's the actual originals of the cartoons the dailies are like 8.5 by 11, and the Sundays are 12 by 22 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And which is different than most cartoonists now, or then. Actually, a lot of cartoonists would do them in a very small, it would be like 2 or 3 times the size that was in the newspaper.
Right.
And in those days, the newspapers actually ran the cartoon considerably bigger than it is now. It's slowly shrunk down.
So back then, he was still writing the panels.
Yeah, yes, everything was written by him. For all those years, he would send me the gag. And when it was Bud who was inking, Dad would draw up the whole thing, and his pencil lines were really tight. What I mean by that is, a lot of if you see like if I use animation as an example, you'll see rough animation that's just all over the place. It's very, very sketchy, and
it's loose. It's very loose and artistic looking.
Correct. And his pencil drawings were really tight, and so Bud would ink pretty much his line exactly.
And the trick to that, I assume, is to make it look super smooth.
Yes, for the family circus, yes, it was because it was with a brush, so there was less sort of etchy look, scratchy looking at all. It was always thick, thin, the curve around the face. Those were all things that I really had to work at.
Were you hand drawing that, right? You weren't using any tools.
No. Yeah, it was all hand drawn. Yeah, everything was hand drawn. Use a ruler.
Sure. Well, that makes sense because you want a straight line's really hard to do, but a curved line is also a trick all by itself.
Yeah, it was. But what was fascinating to me is when I learned that Bud did all the straight lines without a ruler, so to speak. And
wow.
Oh, you're kidding, but then I learned that what it is basically you're running your hand alongside a ruler, and the brush is not touching the ruler. And so you just keep your hand steady, and the key is not to vary the pressure at all as you're drawing a straight line, and that gives a nice.
So the ruler is a guide for the hand, not the brush.
Correct.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting.
And so in some ways, all those things to me were interesting and challenges to see if I could actually accomplish what I was doing, similar to when you're, any show you're cast in, or whether it's a big part, a small part, the key is, to make it into something that is, that you feel this is what it is, and this is the character. This is what I've created.
So there's no question in my mind. I've been a writer for most of my life, and I think the single hardest form of any kind of storytelling is short stories, short movies, short TV shows, short stories, novellas. They're the hardest form of storytelling from my perspective. they don't come any shorter than a single panel cartoon. That's as short as it gets.
That's
So
true.
how challenging is it for you to come up with so many cartoons a year? How do you get your ideas and where does it come from?
Well, for me now, I'm using what my dad's already created, and I'm trying to incorporate now into it, because the way I always thought of it is, the things around families change, but the family itself doesn't change.
Hmm.
So therefore, a cartoon that was in 1970 can be applicable today if it's done in the right way, or it can inspire something that was done today. And in those, the 60s, you might have a cartoon about a typewriter or something like that.
Well,
And then
yeah.
in the 80s, it could be a cartoon about a computer, in the 80s, 90s, and then now it would be something, online, or the way the phone changes, and so in some ways that is what I find challenging now, is to see, I don't want to do something that isn't fit for today, so to speak. But I think you'd be surprised that actually how many things from years ago fit today correctly.
Because as you say, family is still family. That
Family is family now. Maybe the setup of the family is different, but the feeling of the family is the same.
right.
And because I'm doing a cartoon that is in some ways, and it sounds pretentious, but it sounds, in some ways is about feelings as opposed to actions or whatever. And it's the reaction of a mother to a child, or a father to a child, or a brother to a sister, and the way they talk to each other, and those things that are, I don't have to deal with politics, so to speak, or
Well, I don't think that's pretentious at all. I think you're reflecting back exactly why it's so successful, because people want other things than what they're seeing on TV every night on the news.
right. And so I have to keep that in my mind at times, because there's gags or things that I could say, have mommy say this or daddy say this, that is more on my political bent or whatever it is.
Sure.
But I know that there's readers who don't feel that way, and why make them go, oh, I guess this doesn't relate to me, when you can actually just do it. Just like for the past year, I really have done almost zero. In fact, I don't think I've done any cartoons that has any gatherings, any social things, because that's not the life that people were living at this point. Everything was indoors, and if they were outside, I drew a mask on them, because to me that was what people were doing now. Now everybody wasn't doing it, and I'm not making a statement about whether it was. I was just like, this family was doing it.
Right. So the listeners know, this show will sit around for a very long time on the site, and we are recording it in the time of COVID. So if we are lucky enough to finally get past this period of our lives, then it won't sound so strange to know that that's what Jeff was talking about.
that would be great if
It
they
would
go, what time, when were they doing that? What's he even talking about? Let's hope that we get to a point where it becomes like, wow, this is a dated show.
Well, that can happen. It happens to TV shows all the time, doesn't it? But
yeah.
All right. So how many panels a year do you have to come up with?
365.
One a day.
Except on the leap year, then it's 366.
Do you store ideas somehow? Do you collect them?
Yeah, I do. I've got lots of gags. When my dad passed away, there was a whole box that he kept gags in that you could open up and you could see the gags that he'd done, because in some ways he would use those as inspirations for what he wouldn't necessarily do that gag. He would it would inspire him, and then he could put that gag back in and know, oh, well, I can do that one again. No, but it was inspired, and he would do something else. And so, in some ways, that's the way that I do it now too. I go through the years and look for various gags and try and figure out how they can be used nowadays.
In other words, you've made yourself a repository of ideas that you can keep going back to. How do you know, after 60 years of panels, of 365 panels a year, I don't know what that number is, it's thousands and thousands of panels. How do you know you're not just literally copying yourself at this point?
Well, actually, I do at times. I try not to. It was about 30 years ago, when computers were first coming out in the mid 80s, late 80s, 90s. We came up with a FileMaker Pro file that was putting all the cartoons in at that time, and so that because in some ways, in those days, I was sort of like the computer for my dad, because he would say, I've got this idea, Jeff, is Daddy's going to do such and such and this. Did I do that before? And I think maybe my theater background, because when I compiled all those books and put all those things together, I was reading the cartoons, and putting them in an order and deciding what goes where. And so I did have sort of a memory of what was done before. And I'd say, oh yeah, I think you did that. I think that was back in the 80s or whatever. And then we would go and look and try and find it. And so in some ways that was the same thing, but now I've got cartoons, and I try to, look back and see at this time period whether I did that cartoon. And when we were doing that, I did find cartoons that were literally exactly the same cartoon that my dad had done 10 years apart. And it was drawn almost exactly the same caption. And it was like, oh, well, I try not to have anything that can be it's at least within 20 years.
Do you ever get readers that say, hey, that's the same cartoon? Does that ever come your way?
A few times I've had that. A lot of people will comment that saying, oh, this is the same cartoon, when it actually isn't, but it's the same idea, so to speak. And
all right, so once you have an idea, and you've got, obviously you've got lots of them, but once you have one, about how long does it take you to put the whole thing together?
Well, the majority of it would be then drawn. And the way it was basically done is that we try and do 6, you try and do 12 dailies a week, and then the next week do a Sunday, a couple Sundays or whatever. And you're always trying to stay 6 months ahead.
Really? You're 6 months ahead most of the time?
Yeah, my dad was. He was much better. I'm more of a procrastinator. And so I although now with being home all the time, I've gotten a little better, where now I'm almost on the 6-week schedule.
Wow.
And then he would also try and do 7 dailies a week, and so that after every 6 weeks he had another week, because of the daily cartoons. And then he would try and do 2 Sundays. He tried to do 5 Sundays a month, so that at the end of 4 months you'd end up with an extra month and you'd be a month ahead.
Wow. Would he then take time off?
Well, he would always take time off to go play tennis. But it was just, it was a bit of workers in mentality then, of always, he was doing what he loved. He would go out and sit in his studio and draw late at night, and be in there working, because it's what he really liked to do. And and so therefore he did want to have the opportunity that if something came up, he could go do it. It wasn't, oh my gosh. Like I remember when we were doing the USO tour in in Afghanistan, and a couple of the cartoonists. Gary Trudeau was there, and Michael Ramirez. Gary Trudeau does Doonesbury. Michael Ramirez is an editorial cartoonist, and I can remember. I think Michael looking for a FedEx box because he had to drop his cartoon. Well, also editorial cartoons need to stay up to date. And Gary sitting in the in our barracks there in Kandahar, penciling a Doonesbury cartoon.
Wow.
And because he also was on such a tight schedule as opposed to most cartoonists, Gary was working, just, I don't know, 3 weeks ahead or something like that. So he needed to do that. And so that there are those cartoonists who are just procrastinators, and they need to keep as close to the schedule as if they didn't have a schedule. I don't think they would be able to do it.
Well, if you're publishing one a day, 7 days a week, you need to get ahead a little bit so you can take a vacation.
That's right. And my dad did that when we were actually, when we were kids, we used to take family vacations, which actually ended up in the cartoon in those years. We'd go on someplace, and we would load everybody into the station wagon. We'd drive, and
I remember seeing those station wagon cartoons.
Yeah, and then we would do that, and then we'd stop at some place. Mom would put us all in the car the next day and take us to some site or whatever it was, and Dad would stay in the hotel room and draw up the cartoon, and then if it was a great place, then we'd come back the next day. We'd go and take Dad too, and but he was working when we were doing our family vacations too. Because all he needed was a mailbox.
Right.
You drop it in the mailbox, and then he'd finish his thing and mail it in. And
now you don't even need the mailbox, do you?
No. We don't need it for that part. But yeah, everything gets scanned and it's all done
digitally.
Online. Yeah.
You do everything digital. Obviously, as you said, he loved doing what he was doing. So for him, it wasn't really work. It was a joy for him.
Yes.
Same for you. Do you enjoy it as well?
I do. I do enjoy doing it. I enjoy the way it brings me closer to him and my mom and my family growing up. Mm-hmm. Every time I do it, I think about, would Dad like, Dad would like this, and that's important, because in the long run, those are the things that matter to me necessarily. And like I said, I get a lot of credit for something that was really my dad's genius, and that my genius was being smart enough to recognize that, hey, if I do this too, then I get a lot of credit for something.
Well, don't shortchange your own abilities. I mean, you've been carrying the ball for a while, so it's not like it's not like you just went to a drawer and pulled it all out and gave it to someone.
No, but it is one of those things that it's about all of us in the family, mm-hmm. Not just about. It wasn't just about him; it was about my mom too, and all the kids. And it would not have come about if they didn't have this great love for each other. That was, and in those days, a father showing emotion and things might not have been as acceptable as it is now, thankfully, or father caring for kids and things.
Sure. Like that. Right. I'm sure that he helped to pave the way towards those thoughts.
Well, I don't know whether he helped to pave the way, but whatever it is, whoever was paving the way it's much better now that we're all involved in those things now.
All right. So I'm wondering, you've got a panel, you've been working on it, and how do you then know that this is right? Who's your judge?
Me.
All right. So now my assumption is that over time, occasionally you work on something and it's just not right for some reason. Well, how do you resolve it? What do you do?
I don't. Yes, I haven't had too many. I've had, I think, ideas that I just can't get to the right wording of, or something like that. There aren't too many ideas that you can't figure out. But it is a process of, if I'm reading it and I'm really trying to satisfy myself to know that if someone said, why is he saying that? It's like, well, because this is what that's what the kid would say, or that's the reaction to this or that. And when you were talking about doing a single panel gag, in some ways it's easier than doing a strip, and in some ways it's harder.
I would imagine that in some ways it probably is easier because you just have the one concept.
With a strip, you always have to have them saying something here and saying something, and then a final panel. I can do just the final panel, and the key is to have the gag or what they're saying clearly be what, mommy asked this question, this is the kid's answer, and I'm just showing the kid's answer. And so everybody who's reading it is actually doing the previous line without it ever being said.
Well, the strip has to have a beginning, middle, and end of some kind.
Right.
Yours has the beginning, middle, and end all in one.
Right. And so you can get away with, I can get away with more sometimes without having to over explain. But it's also, that's the catch too.
That's
it's
the challenge. That's challenging.
Yeah, you can't just, well, if you have to have the question asked in order for the answer to make sense, sometimes that doesn't work. Every so often you can split the panel, or you can turn it into a Sunday page that comes, as multiple drawings, although Dad would do just one great big drawing sometimes. And that was in some ways easier than a series of stacked boxes of a strip.
Sure. Has it become more of you? Has it become easier for you to do over time?
Yes. I can, I'm able to look at, cartoon and go, oh, I can do this. This will work, or whatever, a lot easier than I did. And also, it took me a while to feel comfortable after my dad died to just relax. Everything doesn't have to be perfect, so to speak, in the sense of I would redraw everything because I felt, I've got to make this completely my own type of thing. And over the years, I've realized, I don't need to do that. If I can use this, I can use this drawing of a wheelbarrow, or pushing the kids, or doing whatever, and daddy's head can change, or mommy's head, and I can simplify what I have to do to make that cartoon. And so I had to, that's a bit of freeing up my own mind in to let myself go that this is, you're doing it okay.
Well, that's a lot of pressure to fill those shoes. Your dad had big shoes. And so for you to fill those shoes, that's a lot of stress. And it's good that you realize
it
that.
wasn't, I get, but he was never putting any stress on me.
No, I didn't mean to imply that he was. You were putting it on yourself because you were trying to live up to an ideal of some kind.
Yeah, and I'm sure it had to do with him being my father.
Of course.
It being our family. And so, but I feel a lot more confident. The other day I was talking to my brother, Neil, and, he said, oh, Jeff, the cartoon the other day was really good. That was a really good one. And that meant a lot to hear,
Sure.
He's reading it, but it's like, oh, that was a good one. And because as cartoonists, you live in coronavirus all your life.
Yes.
You're rarely going out.
Most writers live in isolation.
You're 100% right. That's and so for cartoonists, the only way we were really getting to see the public is if we went to a Comic-Con, or if we went to the Reuben Awards, which was the Cartoonist Academy Awards, so to speak. And we do that once a year, or you go to a Comic-Con, and meeting people at Comic-Con was such a nice thing, especially for me, I found, because people had, as I said earlier, people had such a nice feeling about the cartoon.
Of course, yeah, well,
And
they should.
yeah, and them saying, "Oh, I just like that," or "Oh, can you?" Now, it tends to be, "Can you do a drawing for my grandmother?" As opposed to, "Can you do a drawing?" Then it would probably be like, "Can you draw a drawing for me?" But that's important too.
That's your audience, and they and they are adoring of, I'm sure, what you do.
And also the grandmother influences the mother, influences the child.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the grandmother sending the cartoon, or the mother cutting out. And just as I said, I think as you grow older, once you get into your 30s and you start having kids again, all of a sudden Family Circus makes a lot more sense than it did when we were in college, so to speak.
Well, no doubt, because then you start to relate to it totally differently.
That's right. And the relation is because, the comics page is full of all sorts of different cartoons. And that's the way a comics page should be. It should have cartoons that this cartoon means something to you, and this cartoon means something. Oh, I don't really like that one. Or I don't read that. Or I don't read that. But then over time, you find, oh, yeah, I don't read that one as much as, I found this other one that actually has been there the whole time, but all of a sudden that's relating to you a lot more. And this, and that's the way, those are the comic pages that I like.
Well, it's you don't like your vegetables when you're a kid, but you grow up, then suddenly vegetables taste okay,
Really? I don't feel that way at all.
Well,
vegetables taste okay.
I'll send you a hunk of cheese. It'll fix everything.
Now, cheese is different. Yeah. You put cheese on your vegetables, they're all good. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the media environment as it is right now. At one time, you had over 1,500 papers. I assume a pretty significant number of them, to get down to 1,300, have just simply disappeared off of the face of the earth. And how challenging is this environment right now for someone that does what you do?
Well, I've been blessed by what I was doing, as opposed to, there's a lot of cartoonists who were in those 200 and 250 newspapers that they lost, a huge amount of their income or their means just by one paper dropping. A big newspaper, in those Chicago Sun-Times or New York, Daily News or whatever it was, or LA Times, those pay more than the whatever paper in some smaller town.
Sure.
And so Family Circus luckily would, if a bigger paper or whatever dropped it, it would be picked up by the other paper because they knew readers would read it. Nowadays with papers, they either go out of business or they get combined. Back in the 60s, there actually a lot of cities had two newspapers, had a morning and an evening newspaper.
We did here in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Arizona, in Phoenix. And then slowly, in the 70s, those evening papers started to dwindle. So then that cut readership. And then in the 80s, so then it was all those papers. Then the 90s, as papers combined, and Gannett bought all these, or whoever was, Tribune was buying this, or whatever. Those papers narrowed down. And luckily, I was blessed doing a cartoon that they would rarely drop the cartoon if they're downsizing the comics page, which they've done greatly.
Well, your cartoon is non-controversial. It's non-conflict. It's not insulting to anyone. So yeah, they love it.
Well, yes, and that's a good thing for me. Although I understand, I would like to see a comics page be a little more diverse.
Well, of course.
At times, they don't need, there's, well, we've got Jumpstart. We don't need this other cartoon, or well, let's see. Now we need one. We've got one done by a woman cartoonist, so do we need this other one? And I think that's a mistake, because they're different views, different ideas. You can't just combine them into one thing. Now, I don't want them to throw mine out to do that, but I understand that is, it's a real catch-22 in some sense for me.
I think the other cool thing about the Family Circus is usually in the papers that I've seen it in, it's in a corner somewhere. It's not in the middle of the page, and it's like one of the first things you see. So it's
that was another thing that that my dad did. Putting it in a circle made it
stand out,
and that you see it immediately there, and you recognize it. You know what it is. So many kids learn to read by reading the Family Circus, because they, I think parents knew, well, for one thing, it's going to be fairly easy to read. It's going to stay within the realm of being able to explain, and it's just one caption, and so kids could learn to read by it. I know I have a cartoonist friend, Rick Stromasky, who came and said, the great thing about Family Circus is I taught, my daughter learned to read by it, and that's important.
That's fabulous. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mean, and that has to give you a really good feeling about things.
It's thrilling. Yeah, it is. It once again it goes, well, yeah, my dad knew what he's doing.
Because the interesting thing about it that I didn't even dawn on me until this moment is that those kids that are learning to read by it, they're seeing a picture associated with words, and they're grasping the concept of what those words are saying from the picture itself.
Right. And it's now it may not teach them exactly how to say helping. Instead, they say helping, but
right. Yeah. But that's, to me, that's all good. And then that helps people to a lifetime of learning. But Jeff, we have been talking for an hour, if you can believe that. And because it's flown by for me, that's for sure. And I'm wondering, in all of your experiences and all the things you've done, traveled around the world and done all these cartoons and working with your dad, can you share with us any kind of a story that's either strange, weird, quirky, or maybe just plain funny?
What I have found interesting when we were talking about going to Comic-Cons and things is I'm always surprised by the people who really are Family Circus fans. There was one time we were doing our Reuben Awards in Memphis, and the president at the time, I think Bill Morrison, had connections to various Hollywood people, and he had gotten them various ones to, before an award was given out, say something about cartoons and what they liked and what it was. And when it came to the big prize, which is the Reuben Award, which is the Cartoonist of the Year, before that, then it came on the screen, and Julianne Moore was there, and she said, "Hi, I don't draw." And she said, "Oh, well, no, actually, I can draw, but I just love cartoons. When I grew up, I loved reading, Peanuts and Brenda Starr and Doonesbury, and and Family Circus, because I love Jeffy." But then she said, "and Barfy." So I was on the same level with Barfy. But to me, that was quite a moment. But and I was like, "Oh my gosh, Julianne Moore, darn it!" I'm sure it's because she has red hair, just like I had red hair then. And but the other one was in the 80s. I would when I was living in LA, and I would always get Esquire magazine, and I enjoyed Esquire. In the back page for years was a cartoon by Linda Barry, who did the back page. And I was just like, oh, this is just so great. And it was so diverse and very revealing about ideas and things. So years, I always thought, man, I'd love to meet Linda Barry, because I just think she's great. And she really wasn't a part of the Cartoonist Society. She really is a different sort of person who's, I can't say enough about her. But anyway, in I think in 2000, we had our Reuben Awards in Boca Raton, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I saw the list of names of people who were attending, and Linda Barry was written on there. And I was like, oh my gosh, now I'll get to meet Linda Barry. And so that I was, and before I could get up to her, someone came to me and said, Linda Barry really wants to meet you. And I was like, you're kidding. And he said, no, she's really a Family Circus fan. I was like, oh, really? Wow. And so I walked up to Linda, and as I was walking up, Linda just started crying. Literally, tears were coming. And she held out, I mean, she's shaking, and she held out her hand, and she shook my hand, and she just said, I just love Family Circus, and I love your father. And I was like, oh wow, that's and I never got the chance to tell her that I really do love you. And so years from there, every so often I'll see Linda, and she breaks down in tears every time. And she has told this story. The reason it was because Linda grew up in a family that wasn't like the Family Circus. She had a very hard childhood, and she said she used to sit on the floor and open the comics page, and there she'd see the little circle, and she'd look in the circle, and she'd imagine that her family was like that, or that she could be like that. And when she saw me and she reached out and we shook hands and she touched my hand, she realized she had gotten through that circle and was now in that family. And to me, that's the great thing about what Family Circus means.
That is an amazing story, really.
It is. And that was the genius of my dad, my mom, and my brothers and sister.
Well, you've touched the entire world. Everybody, as we said earlier, there's probably very few places on earth that would not relate to what's going on in there, because it's about parents and children, and that's ubiquitous. Right. Doesn't matter where you live or what your language is.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. That was a great story. All right, last question for today, Jeff. Do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip for those that may be trying to break into being a cartoonist? Or maybe they're in a little bit, maybe they're starting their career and they're trying to get to the next level. Do you have any thoughts for that?
I think the key is, as my dad showed, was you've got to do what means something to you.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just come up with a winning formula, because it's not going to last. You're going to find yourself stuck if all you want to do is be successful, so to speak, in quotes. You're not going to do something you really love, because in the long run, yeah, it might be good for a little while, but some cartoonists want to, I'm going to do a cartoon about such and such because nobody's doing that. If it doesn't really mean something to you, you're not going to be able to sustain that over years and years and years. All of a sudden, you're going to find, wow, I'm now stuck. I can't go anywhere beyond this. The best thing is to do what you know, do what you like. And, as my mom would always say, does it make you happy? because that's the more important thing. Does it make you happy?
Mm-hmm. I think that's incredibly wise and valuable advice, and I think it applies to a lot of types of the arts, or frankly anything, business of all sorts. That if you aren't enjoying what you're doing, if you don't have an affinity for it, it probably will not be a lot of fun to do, and it may not work for you. It may not last for a long time. But in particular, when you're an artist like you are, it has to be that. If not, it won't last. I think that's terrific advice. Jeff Keane, this has been just a tremendous hour plus on StoryBeat today, and I cannot thank you enough for joining me on the show. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Steve. It was great seeing you again.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.